All right, I think we can begin now. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. And welcome to our Daily Maverick webinar, Holding Out for H₂O, Examining Water Loss in South African Cities. So, I'm Julia Evans. I'm an environmental journalist with Daily Maverick, and I'll be your host as we unpack one of the most urgent issues facing our cities. Why do we not have a constant supply of water when this is the most basic human right? Across South Africa, communities are waking up to dry taps or trickle of water when millions of liters of treated water are lost every day through leaking pipes, inefficient use, and illegal connections as free basic water is not being properly provided. Some cities are losing as much as 40% of their water before it even reaches homes and businesses. So to help us understand and unpack what's really going on and what can be done, I'm joined by Dr. Ferrial Adam, Executive Director of WaterCAN, who has a wealth of hands-on experience with communities on the ground, and Professor Mike Muller, who is the former Director General of Water Affairs and now is a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. He has a crucial understanding of how national government operates and how South Africa's water systems work. Please remember throughout the whole webinar to drop any questions you have for our panelists in the chat, and I'll get to them throughout the webinar. It's a real privilege to have both of these speakers with us today, so let's make the most of it. So what's quite interesting is that while the water crisis is front of mind for many of us across cities in South Africa, until the last few years, Gauteng Quality of Life surveys found that a large majority of people were actually satisfied with their water. But in the last 5 years, that changed. Mike, what do you think is going on, and why did that satisfaction go down?
Gauteng is just one example. I mean, we can look at Cape Town. Why did people get upset with the water supply in Cape Town? Well, because there wasn't any, because they didn't build dams quickly enough. Why did people in Nelson Mandela Bay get really upset? Again, they were relatively happy, and then they had a real big problem. They spent a couple of years stealing water from each other's swimming pools, and people were unhappy. And we can look now at Gauteng and realize that if 90%, and that's where it was over 85, pushing 90% of people in Gauteng in 2018 said they were happy. Can you imagine why it should drop now down to just 75%, which is still high? And the answer is because the supply has become unreliable. And in each case, we know why the supply became unreliable. There were problems in Nelson Mandela Bay and Cape Town. They didn't do what they should have done to bring more water to more people quickly enough. And the same is happening in Gauteng. But just for the under 40s, let me just remind people that in 1994, there were 36 million people in South Africa, 24 water infrastructure. Where we're standing at the moment is almost 60 million people with water infrastructure. Unfortunately, quite a lot of that doesn't work. But we've more than doubled the amount of people with water infrastructure. It's not surprising we're running to catch up. So I think essentially what's happening, we've got a lot more people wanting a lot more water, and we're not keeping up with that. And that's when you open the tap and there's no water. That's the backstory.
Yeah, I think that's really important context. But in terms of leaks, I think this is really, really crucial. In the city of Johannesburg, where I live and where Ferrial lives, we have over 40% of non-revenue water, which is obviously water that Rand Water treats and then doesn't earn any revenue back on through multiple reasons, but the large majority is actually through leaks. And this is not just happening in Joburg, it's in eThekwini, Nelson Mandela Bay, other cities. Ferrial, what's the main causes of these water losses?
So I think a lot of it, as you've mentioned, so when you talk about water loss, by the way, it's not just leaks, right? So when you look at non-revenue water, there's leaks, there's the non-billable water because municipalities are just not billing correctly. And then there's what they call theft, which, there's a whole range of issues around that as well. But the main loss, in a sense, is from leakage. So that's aging infrastructure. That's and it's not just the pipes, right? It's not just the water pipes that's coming to your homes that's aging. It's the pump stations, it's the reservoirs. I mean, in Johannesburg, at least half of our reservoirs have a leak. they only have allocated to fix about 20 of those, and they haven't even started yet. And they've known about this for a while. So it's the aging infrastructure, but it also, I think, what Mike has done in terms of linking it to, you know, the historical sense is that for almost 10 years, and I think I've been saying for almost 10 years for a number of years, so it's probably now reaching 15 years, there hasn't been adequate budget being spent on maintenance of our infrastructure. So if you allow kind of technical things like pump stations, reservoirs, and pipes to just, you know, just to be for 10 years, of course that's going to be deteriorating and that's going to age. So when you do have bursts, it's not just a burst in one place. It kind of then becomes along the pipe because the pipe is so old. Or the pump stations, you fix it, it breaks again tomorrow. And that's part of the frustration. So when you ask what is the causes, that's partly it. So it's the fact that local government, at a local government level, we have not had the correct spending. There's been mismanagement and there is corruption, but we haven't rooted it out yet. And that is the core reason for why we're experiencing what we're experiencing right now across South Africa. And you're right, because, you know, you and I in Joburg, but this is a national issue. In eThekwini, they lose about 50% of their water that they produce.
Wow.
Joburg, we know. City of Tshwane is about 34%. Ekurhuleni is about 33%. Emfuleni loses 71% of its water. So I think that, yeah, so so they're staggering. It's not just, and then you get the smaller municipalities. So the worst municipalities in terms of the biggest percentage of water lost is in the Northern Cape, 73% in a municipality, 73% in another, like, so there's different municipalities at that level. Free State, Masilonyana, 72%. So nationally, the numbers are even more staggering than in Joburg. But in Joburg, we are the media focuses here. There's all eyes on Joburg, and so we can actually follow that with the street pictures, etc. We have a much more vocal civil society here as well.
I actually want to ask you another question, Ferrial. It's from the chat, I know, because you have a lot of experience with this. Andrea asks, why don't we hold municipal managers responsible for water loss from the entities they manage? And she cites Dewitt's Half Retirement Village in Kensington management as guilty. I just like to point out that WaterCAN has actually taken some municipal managers and mayors to court over water issues. But would you like to respond to that, Ferrial?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that is a brilliant question, because what has happened previously is that people have charged municipalities, right? Whether it is for water losses or not having access to water or pollution. And the municipalities, for pollution specifically, have then paid a fine. But that money comes from the ratepayers who pay our rates to the municipality, so that money comes out, so there's less that they can do. We're saying, why punish the whole municipality? We need to start firing people like municipal managers, and people in positions of power need to own up and actually be fined personally or go to jail. So yes, I'm completely in agreement with that. Now, let me just add, the Department of Water and Sanitation has amended the National Water Act. I don't agree with some of the things that they've amended, but the one thing that they have done is that they can now also, they put in place where people, whether it's private or government, can be charged for mismanagement and wastage and pollution.
Yeah. Mike, you've actually seen inside how the government works, having been the previous Director General. Do you think that a lot of this is down to governance failures and corruption and lack of transparency, or is it more down to capacity issues?
I think we should always remember that the government is one side of it and the people who use the water are the other side of it. And one of the things that's happened as we've brought in 250% more people into the system is that there's a lot more people trying to get water, and the governments, whether they're municipal or national, are trying to keep up. And if we think that that's an easy job and that somehow people are failing, I think we're starting with the wrong approach. This is a rather difficult job. Lots of people have got lots of different ideas about how to spend public money. And someone has to do the juggling between, do we put a new tap into that village or do we put an extra reservoir into Johannesburg? So I don't think it's helpful to look always at government failure. Government has to do rather a lot with rather a little. And I'm not sure that we are always willing to accept that if Gauteng's population doubles, the first priority is going to be to put in water infrastructure for those 8 million new people. You can't have 8 million people without water, right? They're here.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Now, that does mean, and it comes back to this question, has the infrastructure been maintained? That the priority is always what you see immediately in front of you. The fact that the pipes are rusting underground very slowly, they can last for 50 years if you're lucky, but they are rusting. And I think we've been able to say, yeah, they haven't upgraded the infrastructure fast enough. But remember, it's always a balance. Do we spend money on supplying people who don't have anything, or do we spend the money on upgrading? And Ferrial has already said part of the problem is that a lot of the money that gets paid for water to the municipalities actually goes somewhere else. Now, if we're not spending the money that we get for water on water, then of course there's going to be a bit of a shortage. And that's what I think is being addressed at the moment by government. Can we make sure that the money that is spent and paid for water gets to people? The other thing, Julia, that we really have to remember, and people on this webinar are the 5 and 10% of the richest people in the country. Fully half the people in this country cannot afford food to eat. They can't afford enough food. So don't be surprised when they don't then pay for water. The problem is, if you don't have a tap, it's quite easy. You don't get water, you don't have to pay for it through the tap. But once you've provided the infrastructure, it is really quite difficult to persuade people you've got a tap, but you can only use it this little bit for this little bit and that little bit, which is why the non-revenue water is so high, because people have access, but they can't afford it. They use it and then they can't pay. And then we're in that kind of crisis at the moment where a lot of people don't have enough money to meet all their needs. And water is actually one of the things that they can perhaps not pay for because you can't just cut it off. We've got a constitution which stops that. So I do think we've got to remember that half the people in this country cannot afford to pay for water at all. And a lot of the other 50%, apart from the ones who are watching this webinar, are actually struggling every day to get enough money to go backwards and forwards to work, to feed the kids, to put them to school, and water comes at the bottom of the bills. And that's where we have a lot of issues, and we have to think as a community, how do we talk to those problems? Because if we just keep throwing stones at government, quite frankly, we won't achieve anything. We'll just set up a big fight and everyone will be rude about each other and the water won't come out of the tap.
Yeah, I really agree actually. And someone anonymous asked in the chat if they think that South Africa is at the point where we need to consider amending the constitution, given that municipalities have been able to fulfill their mandate. Micah, I'd like to hear your thoughts, but I just off the top of my head, I'd like to say that South Africa has one of the best constitutions in the world. And it does stipulate the basic right to water. But what you mentioned is a really important point about not everyone being able to afford water. So South Africa does provide free basic water for encumbered houses, which is like, I think, 6,000 liters a month. But not everyone who is entitled or in that bracket of should be getting free basic water is getting free basic water. And then obviously there's the knock-on impacts of illegal connections because people are forced into the situation. So Mike, do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think enough people who genuinely can't afford free basic water are actually being provided that by the government adequately? And do you think our constitution needs to be amended?
Yeah, the constitution needs to be amended, not to say that people don't have a right to water. when you see, this is why I was talking about the under 40s here. When the Constitution was negotiated, which is now 30 years ago, and some of us kind of, it feels like yesterday, but other people weren't even born at that point. When the Constitution was negotiated, there were some people who were very anxious that local government should be ring fenced and protected, and national government shouldn't be able to interfere with it. And the Constitution is very clear. Local government is an autonomous sphere of government. It's not a level of government with one level above the other. It's a sphere. And national government can't just tell local government what to do. What that has allowed is all sorts of indiscipline and mismanagement and all the kind of problems you get if you're able to run something and no one oversees you. You basically get money through equitable share and through grants, and the way you spend it is really up to you. So to the extent that the Constitution needs to be amended, it is to allow national government to step in when the local governments fail to deliver adequate services.
Yeah.
That's being discussed at the moment, but I can tell you it is very high politics, because there's rather a lot of local government politicians who would rather not have national government departments able to come in and say, you're messing up, you better do a better job. And that includes in Johannesburg, by the way.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I didn't think about it, the Constitution in terms of that. That's a really good point. But speaking of ring fencing and holding the municipalities more accountable, so City of Joburg approved a turnaround strategy, which includes allowing Joburg Water, which is obviously the service provider for water, to ring fence its revenue. Whereas before, the money for water services was pooled into the city's whole budget. But now this strategy includes ring fencing, which sounds really great. And people keep asking me this as well, Ferrial, like, is that actually happening? It sounds great on paper. So Ferrial, like, is that actually happening? Would this be a really great solution? I know that this is specific to Joburg, but across all cities, if they did ring fence specifically for water services.
So yes, definitely. It's something we've been campaigning for. It's something that I think all levels of government have also been asking for, is for ring fencing of the budget for water and sanitation. So I know that that was in City of Johannesburg. You're right. It was accepted in November, December 2024 by council, but it hasn't been put into plans yet. So that's the thing, is that there's this disjointed kind of action where that's done, and we were like, yes, you know, we've gained something. This is what we've been calling for. But then when you look at the budgets and you look at Joburg Water has a turnaround strategy, which is not bad. It's actually a good turnaround strategy. Good people have worked on that strategy. But there's no budget for the strategy. So when you look at the new budget, there's no additional budget allocated to Joburg Water. In fact, the adjustment budget, we were saying at the moment, Joburg Water, from all the money it gets in, it brings in about combined water and sanitation, about 12 billion to the city, right? It's rough amount.
Yeah.
They get, besides for operations, etc., so they get 1.2 billion for capex. That's just fixing of pipes and all of that. That's 1.2. Joburg Water has said repeatedly in presentations they've done everywhere, they need at least 2.5 to 3 billion to actually work properly and get things done. But what was the adjusted budget that they got when the recent budget happened? 70 million additional to the 1.2. Like, what? You know, you can't even buy a car for that other mayor who bought cars for 5 million or whatever. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that there isn't that consistency. They say one thing to appease us, but there isn't that consistency. And I just want to add something. I know that Mike says don't throw stones at government, but let me tell you, we're sitting in the city of Joburg and we have a little bit more of a responsive utility. So Joburg Water, less so the city of Joburg, but then because it's city of Joburg, the president comes in and forms this working groups and everything starts happening. But WaterCAN works nationally. And I can tell you that I want to throw rocks, not stones, at the municipalities, because it's simple things that they can engage with civil society on, simple issues. but they do not even respond to emails. And I'm not talking about, it's middle management people. It's people that we get from the DG who says, email this person, and they do not respond. So I'm sorry that we have to be honest. Even the AG's report has talked about the fact that municipalities are in trouble and we need to hold them accountable. So that is the kind of thing. And I think that is important to note. Also, just one more thing on the issue of people not paying. So it's interesting, right? Because there's the free basic water. We're not allocating the amount that they have that should be getting free basic water in Joburg. And I'm just taking Joburg as an example because I've just written a piece on it. Is that we think people are not paying, but they're indirectly paying for water. So what's happening in the townships where there's no water and people have to rely on JoJo tanks or water tanks? The elderly or the sick can't go fetch the water. So what are they doing? They're paying young people outside to go fetch. It's become a business to go fetch water for them. So the young people, this is great. This is pocket money. But they're charging R1 a liter. So if you're going to use money, like water every day, you're going to send people to get a bucket of water. You're going to pay for it. And it's coming out of SASSA grants. So people want water. They'll pay for it. And we think people are not paying, but they're indirectly paying for it because of the system that we have right now.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I'm glad that we have a civil society and more of a governance perspective. That's what makes this webinar interesting. But just quickly, Danny asked an interesting question. Obviously, there was water tariff hikes this year, and Danny asks, do water tariffs currently sufficiently cover the maintenance backlog? Are these even unrealistic expectations at the municipal level? So Ferrial, can you speak to that? And also when you said the turnaround strategy is good on paper, but it's not being implemented, I don't understand why that's happening. Like why is it not being implemented? Is it a money issue?
So it's partly a money issue. It's partly also the way that government is working right now, because you've got this utility that's Joburg Water that does this strategy, but then you've got City of Joburg that has the purse strings. So you've got two different bodies, planning things, and I don't think they say they do, but I don't see it in practice. So no, the water tariffs won't. But I think that what the water tariffs do is they do assist with kind of maintaining what we have right now. Now remember, we have about 12,000 kilometers of water pipes and about 11,000 kilometers of sewage pipes. These things need to be fixed. They need to be replaced. We only have budget to replace 14 kilometers a year. And that's nothing. So it does help in terms of, but it's not enough for the maintenance. Remember, we're dealing with a 10-year backlog. We're dealing with aging infrastructure. We're dealing with 20 reservoirs that are leaking and that should rightfully actually be focused on right now. The fact that places like Emerentia, Greenside, Kensington areas, the reservoirs are the problem. And until those get fixed, nothing's going to happen. I saw there was a question earlier about Lesotho Highlands. We can have all that water, but if we don't have an infrastructure that can deal with it, then what? You can't actually add on to the system. But that's the challenge. And I think also, Julia, is that we don't have the different departments talking to each other. So spatial development, the fact that we need high density, this is true, but can we deal with high density in those areas that they're identifying? So those are the challenges, and I don't think that there's this coordinated approach to what's going on in terms of water. And Mike might disagree, but that's what I think at the moment.
Yeah. Well, interesting you bring up spatial development. Richard Holden asked if South Africa can afford spatial development patterns with very low density with its GDP per person. But just speaking to what you said, it's very difficult. Johan also asked, do we have any chance of making a dent in the problem under the current government, especially in Gauteng? So when you're saying there isn't enough money and there's all this backlog, what do we actually do? What is the solution, or is that not really clear? Mike, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, the answer is it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick, because part of the problem that we're seeing, and let's not forget this, is that the money that gets paid for water or doesn't get paid for water doesn't just go to the city. It also goes to Rand Water, which treats all the water and brings it from the Vaal up to the cities of Gauteng. And Rand has to pay the department to build small dams like the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, which is what we need to bring enough water into the cities. So what we're seeing happen at the moment, and it's actually very serious, is that people aren't paying for their water in the city. The city isn't paying the water board enough for its the service it gets, and the boards are going to have troubles paying for the national projects that make the water available. So we do have a financial crisis here, and it would be a very good idea for us to take a deep breath and ask the question, so how do we work going forward? Part of the problem is we can always choose. We can use less water, in which case we have to build less new infrastructure, and then we can spend more money fixing the current infrastructure. But I'd invite you to go around to some of the northern suburbs and tell people to use less water because the other people in the cities need it, because you'll find that they actually don't even think about it. They don't do much about it. But that's water demand, and it happens in the townships as well. People who've got still on flat rates, they've got a flat rate, they use water, they might use 20 kiloliters where the free basic is 6, they don't pay for it. So everyone needs to understand that if we carry on not to use our water better and use less of it, we're going to carry on building up this financial backlog, which is now billions and billions, by the way. So how do we start talking to each other about how we use less water so that we have more money available from what we pay to keep fixing and renewing the infrastructure and expanding it to new people? That's why I get worried when we start throwing stones, from the public to the government and the government back to the public. Because if we don't have that conversation, I can promise you that for the next 3 years, and it's probably going to happen anyway, Gauteng certainly is going to have increasingly strict water supply problems. And if we don't formally restrict the lucky people like me, I'm sitting somewhere where I've never had a water cut, but there are people in Joburg East, who are being cut off 4 days of the week. Now, until we solve that problem, how do we work together and reduce our water use? We're either going to have to find money, which we don't have, to keep building the things on time, or we're going to not build things on time, and then we'll have a couple of years of more and more restrictions. And it comes back to what I said at the beginning. 6 years ago, people thought that Gauteng water supply was great. Now that it gets cut off very regularly for about a quarter of the population, people actually being cut off, complaining. But have we worked together and said, how did Cape Town manage to restrict their water supply so heavily? And the answer was really easy. Cape Town just showed people pictures of empty dams and said, if you carry on using like this, we're going to run out. Unfortunately, in Gauteng, we show pictures of full dams, and people say, well, there's no, I think there was a question here on the chat. Why with full dams do we have water restrictions? The answer is because if we use all that water in the dams and there's a drought, we will then be in worse trouble than Cape Town was. As and Nelson Mandela Bay can explain that to you, because that's exactly what happened to them. They had water in the dam, they didn't do the work to bring it to the city, and then they had a drought. And they spent 2 years of real hardship because of that water supply failure. So I'm afraid we have to take a deep breath, think quite hard. And the first thing we should start thinking about is how, as city and people who use water, do we start reducing the amount of water we use? And if necessary, maybe the city is going to have to restrict water use. And how do you do that? You charge people a lot of money if they go over a certain limit. It worked quite well in Cape Town. They survived. But there, as I say, they could see the empty dam and they understood it. Here you look at a full dam and say, why do I have to restrict? And the answer is because if there's a drought like Cape Town and Nelson Mandela Bay, we'll be looking worse than them because we won't have any options. So
that makes
people
sense.
must start working together and stop throwing stones at each other.
Yeah.
With respect to Ferrial, I know she enjoys throwing bricks, but
No, I know.
No.
Well, I'm glad. Well, I know that you guys work together, and that's why it's really great that we're having you both here today. But just to understand with a lot of cities, especially again, people in the chat are noting it's really not just Joburg, eThekwini, Nelson Mandela Bay, various cities across the country have been hit with water rationing, water cuts. But I just want to understand this, right? It's not just that we're losing a lot of treated water because water is running down the streets because of infrastructure issues and unbuilt connections and all that stuff. Is it that? And also, a lot of privileged people are consuming more than the above like necessary amount of water. Like in South Africa, is there a culture of people using more water than is necessary, Mike? That's what I just kind of wanted to understand, because I often hear from the current water minister, not to bring it back to Joburg again, we have like such a high consumption. And then I'm like, well, obviously, because we're losing so much water running down the street. But you do bring a really valid point, and a lot of like huge like wealthy suburbs have massive gardens and pools, and yeah, we like fill up our pool with treated water and all of this stuff. So does South Africa have a culture of using too much water? Mike.
Is that okay?
Okay, he's frozen.
There was a question earlier about a question earlier about the spatial issues. And it is true that South African cities have very large areas, or had very large areas of garden, and used a lot of water because of that. But I think that if we look at it now, the spatial picture is changing. And now we just have very large cities with very large expanses of infrastructure that give us challenges. I do think, though, that we are going to have to understand that what we're doing is not fixing leaks. What we're doing is replacing old infrastructure, as Ferrial says, that should have been replaced 5 or 10 years ago. So part of the problem, do you run around fixing leaks, or do you actually say we're going to have to delay sometimes fixing leaks because we want to actually spend money on laying pipes which aren't going to leak? And there we have a problem of capacity, because I've watched Johannesburg Water at work fixing leaks. And quite often, and I think we all know this in all the cities across South Africa, something leaks, it gets fixed. It's a bodged job, and they're back again in a week's time. And they're working overtime. Not that they do the job properly. And that's why we keep getting these repeated leaks. The pipes are old, they're not fixed properly. Where do we build the capacity in the cities to do the job properly so it's fixed first time and it doesn't keep failing and failing and failing again?
Yeah. No, I agree. And like people have been saying in the chat, it's not just Joburg, and every city has different issues. I wanted to bring it back to eThekwini because they faced quite a unique issue in the April 2022 floods, damaged a lot of their sewage and water infrastructure, and they're still facing water cuts because of that. And like a lot of people have mentioned in the chat and have just mentioned in general, like, why is it that we have water cuts when there's been so much rain? And Ferrial, like, I'm not trying to sound alarmist here, but it is a fact that there's going to be more frequent extreme rainfall events and more frequent droughts under climate change than if there wasn't anthropogenic climate change. Like, we might experience more severe droughts in our lifetime than we would have if climate change didn't exist. So we need to prepare for those differently, and eThekwini is a good example of that. Can you speak to how communities have suffered following the 2022 floods, and what we need to do to prepare our water systems better for those sorts of events that will happen again?
Thanks, Julia. I mean, I think firstly I need to say that KZN does say that the 2022 floods was what damaged the infrastructure. But I just want to add that before that, we were tracking the quality of water in rivers across KZN. And the eThekwini municipality was also doing it pretty well. And they were very good in providing this online. And we looked at pre-2022 in terms of the amount of effluent, particularly sewage, flowing into the rivers and streams. It was almost as high as post-2022. So the wastewater treatment works in the municipality have always been suspect. They like to say that it's because people are throwing baby nappies, and it does increase the E. coli in the rivers, but it is not as bad as the wastewater treatment works, right? So the infrastructure, like every other place in South Africa, has been struggling for more than just the 2022 floods. Having said that, what happened with the 2022 floods is that if you have aging infrastructure that you have ignored, it's bad, and you have that rain bomb as we had it, then trying to actually fix things after that becomes a nightmare. And that is why we're saying in Joburg and other places, we need to make sure that our maintenance is done so that we can withstand the impacts of climate change. And the other thing about eThekwini is that in terms of the drinking water, so together with their wastewater treatment works, the drinking water quality has completely, and I think in KZN, it lies completely at a municipal level. At some municipalities, they just do not function well. And, I'm sorry, Mike, for throwing the stones again, but we have tried to engage. The Department of Water and Sanitation has set up a similar structure like the platform in Gauteng to look at non-revenue water, to look at how to deal with people saving, etc. It exists in eThekwini. We've got WaterCAN in that body as well, but we don't seem to have the kind of engagement we need with municipalities to actually listen to people on the ground on what is going on. And it's not just the eThekwini municipality. So when we talk about KZN, we mustn't just focus on eThekwini, because there are other municipalities who are even worse off in the KZN region, right? So what that does is it breaks the trust deficit. And I think that with the platform, there is a move to put new people to kind of consult and work with government, work with civil society to do that. But it's eThekwini focused. And a lot of the challenges, if you look at the North Coast and the South Coast, are other municipalities that are just not doing what they're not prioritizing, in my view, from what I've seen, or willing to engage. And then that kind of rock throwing becomes worse. And we found that I went to a community, they were ready to protest. All they wanted was to be heard by a municipal someone. And municipalities close the minute they know that they're not doing what they need to do. They close doors, they shut down. So they don't allow that engagement. And until there's openness and engagement, then that's just going to get worse. And yes, the infrastructure in KZN is also in a pretty bad situation.
Yeah. But speaking of like what we can do and how like local government could be managed better, Felicity asks if there's other cities around the world who've experienced the same problem and how they resolved that. Mike, do you know of other cities, or if not, can you speak to a little bit more about working on these local government issues?
Yeah. Look, there's plenty of other cities where they haven't prepared for droughts. They've had droughts and they've run into crisis. Let me go: Sydney, Melbourne, Barcelona, Sao Paulo. I can go on for a few more. A lot of big cities don't do the right thing at the right time because democratic government always has a short-term problem which they want to throw the money at, and they tend to ignore the longer-term one. We have a slightly different problem. We have a very unequal society, a hugely unequal society. And on the one hand, we have to do something for the very poor, and on the other hand, we have to maintain services for people who are relatively the very rich. And that's a very different do. One reason then for trying to take out this water supply business, the provision of water, the technical business from the municipalities, is in fact to say, you can't leave this kind of activity in the political framework because there are too many pressures. You will never get the right answer at the right time. Going back again 40 years, there was a proposal put during the negotiations on the negotiating table. We said there were three options for water supply in South Africa. We could build one big national utility, which has happened in quite a few countries, by the way. We could give it all to little local municipalities who would run into capacity problems, but it would be very democratic. Or we could try and set up 10 or 15 big water supply utilities like they do in the Netherlands and they do in Britain and they do in a couple of other places. And those utilities would have the job of running the water, and then they would have to report to the local political heads of each municipality about whether they did their job properly. Now, there was a strong push back in 1994 to keep local autonomous, and it was crazy because on the one hand, the white minority wanted to have small municipalities which they could control, and the black majority said, we're going to have democratic local government. We will manage these municipalities in a proper fashion. And in fact, neither side got what they wanted. The local municipality, the small controlled minority municipality didn't happen because it was going to be too small. And big democratic local government has been like big democratic local government in many parts of the world and has got to be quite corrupt and tends to be very short term. So what we're seeing happen at the moment is the suggestion from the national government, but they have to be very careful because there's politics here. Why don't we insist on having competent water service providers serving the municipalities? They must have proper staff, they must have proper structures and the competences to run their business. They can then report to the water services authorities, which will be the politicians, the municipalities. Now, that's a direction that could be taken because the legislation allows us to separate the provider from the authority. And it was drawn up like that in 1996, imagining we might get to the state where we are now. But now we have this problem. To make that work, the municipalities have to accept that if they can't show that they can do the job, they're going to have to hand over to some people who can, not just hand over the work, but hand over the money to do the work. And that's where we are at the moment in South Africa. We're at a crossroads of whether we're going to insist that water supply, like in Kenya, by the way, should be run by competent, regulated providers, and they must report to the politicians, but the politicians don't tell them how to do the work, or whether we leave it in the hands of the politicians in the municipalities. And I think that's actually the big step that has to be taken at the moment. And we're going to have to choose whether we want this super democratic local municipality government or whether we want water services that are professionally operated but are overseen by the political heads and allowed to do their work, but have to demonstrate that they're doing it properly. That's where we are at the moment in South Africa. And I don't think that enough people understand that we've got a big choice to make and that there's a lot of local government politicians who would rather keep things as they are because they rather enjoy the control over the budget and the staff and the rest, even if they can't make the services work very well.
But yeah, you're right. I don't think many people do understand that we have that choice. So it's very interesting to have you here because you were there when all of this was sort of being set up and decided. So you're saying like in the Netherlands, they have this sort of, well, that was one of the examples, the system where they have like 15 competent water bodies who report to the politicians in the municipalities, right? That's what I'm getting from you is kind of what could be a solution for us and what our policies allow, but we just need to like what would we have to do to get that system shifted that way?
Yeah, the question is that the Constitution was quite carefully written, but it gives the authority to run water to municipalities. It does then say national government can regulate those municipalities to do the job properly. And the fight that's going on is whether that regulation means that we have to have people standing in Pretoria and Cape Town and waving their fingers at the municipalities, you must do this properly, or whether it allows the national government to say, look, we've given you a couple of chances, you've really messed up badly, your people are throwing bricks at you, why don't you just allow somebody competent to come in and do the job? That's where we're going to. But unfortunately, the municipalities have a lot of power. They tend to elect the heads of the political parties for a start. You know, the municipal councillors are local politicians who vote for just, political heads at national level.
Yeah.
So we've got to make the politics work so that we're allowed to help the municipalities to do the job properly. If they can't do it properly, they must get somebody who can do it properly. Everyone says, oh, it's privatization. It doesn't have to be privatization. Rand Waters and Mgeni are already helping municipalities to run their systems. But that's the kind of dilemma we face at the moment. And it would be nice if we had more public conversation. So it's really nice we have this chance if we had more public conversation about this option, because it gives the municipalities a way to escape the trap they've dug for themselves. And it gives national and the people a chance to get slightly better services than we get at the moment.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad we're having this conversation. But just to clarify, because this is really interesting and a very critical point, and like we both said, I don't even fully understand it, and definitely the public doesn't fully understand it. Vanessa wants you to clarify, and you just kind of said it already, but just to clarify again, you're not proposing privatization of water, right? Because if yes, what are the dangers of that? Mike, just to quickly clarify that.
Okay, and look, I mean, the dangers of privatization are obvious. Go and look at Britain, where they had the wonderful private sector provision, and London is a total disaster, and people are being ripped off, and they're still not getting the service they expect. The point is that you've got to, your providers have got to be allowed to do the job. And quite frankly, whether they're public or private, you still have to have someone looking over their shoulder and cracking the whip and able to say, if you don't do your job properly, we're going to take it and give it to somebody else. Now, that requires a degree of political maturity that is hard to find. Funnily enough, my colleagues in Kenya have more or less got that right. If, you know, they've got a regulator who's very competent, and when there's a problem in a municipality where the services aren't working, he'll cancel the license of this provider. And that actually has been. And, you know, we haven't been very successful. If you look at our energy regulator, we have all sorts of problems. And, you know, we mustn't imagine it's an easy job. But I think it's a job that we have to tackle, because, quite frankly, if we don't, we are going to see more and more of the current situation of water supply failures. And each time it fails, it's going to cost more and take longer to get things properly again. And that's what should really be worrying us. We're allowing a situation to deteriorate to the point where it's going to be very difficult to recuperate.
Yeah, no, agreed. And Ferrial, I want to bring you into this because you've also been in this space for many years and were around when the transition was happening. What do you think about this? And then afterwards, Christina is asking, do you think civil society can prioritize a skills audit to determine what our deficits are? And other people are asking, basically, are our municipal managers and municipalities capable? Do they actually have the skills to do the job? What are your thoughts, Ferrial?
Okay, so there's so much I need to respond to.
I know.
Let me start first with the issue of the water service providers and the water service authorities that Mike was talking about. So the amendments to the Water Act do allow for that. It just hasn't been signed into power yet, but it does allow for government, the national government, to then take the responsibility away from a municipality, the water service authority, and provide it to someone else. The challenge, though, and I think one of the people mentioned, I think it was Vanessa, about privatization. Vanessa, I am concerned about that. It is my worry, because what we see is, and it links to what Mike was saying, is that political maturity. We don't have that political maturity in South Africa. We have not dealt with corruption adequately in the water sector and at local government level. So what could happen is you have the demise, you allow your system to become so defunct that the only thing people are screaming for, and we're seeing it right now, is privatize. Let's get a private company to do this, as if they're the answer to everything. And my concern is we need to think that through, so that it's not handing over And I know the DG has said this before, it's not privatization, but I'm not seeing it as anything different. There was an article written about the different types of privatization we have right now. You know, the idea of privatization in the early 90s, for example, was where you hand over your water services and resources to someone else and they own it and they sell it and they make money from it. But there are other models. This whole thing of public-private partnerships as well needs to be explored, because when you look at it, the only thing I see is the private sector giving the money, the private sector doing the development, and governments there just their service is being done. So we need to really explore those models properly. I do agree with Mike. The present system is not working, but that does not mean that we need to go this way. That's on the one thing. On the issue of, do we have managers that are skilled and all of that? Look, we do. But think about it this way. If you know, at Joburg Water, we deal with some very good engineers. We've high level skills, engineer, MBA kind of stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
But if you don't have the budget to do what you need to do, then of course it's a problem. The other person, I'm cutting the questions, I know we're out of time. Skills audit. So part of the blue drop and green drop assessments, and I know people know about the blue drop, green drop. Blue drop is drinking water, green drop is wastewater. What they do is when they do the assessment, and this is run by the Department of Water and Sanitation, they also, one of the things that they score is skills. So you can actually look at that in the previous blue drops. It's in there. So that, in a sense, is being done. I think the AG's report has also done something on that. So it is being done. I like the idea of a civil society audit, but then it needs budget, and we don't have that. I want to add something about the water saving and the fact that everyone in South Africa needs to become more aware of our water shortages, the scarcity, all of that. And yes, it's a very unequal system. So when we do that, we do have homes that have 2 bathrooms and another toilet and a swimming pool and. We need to change our mindset, because with climate change, with the level of water that we're having, we either need to think seriously about paying having a stepped tariff. The more you use, the more you pay. And the reason why people in Cape Town were more on board and listened to government when they said save was because it was a drought. Here in Joburg, if you tell people to save, they laugh at you because they walk outside and they see a leak and they're saying, if local municipality is not saving or fixing the leak, why should I? Please, we cannot have that mindset. I'm urging people. We have to start saving water. Yes, we have an infrastructural problem, and yes, the municipalities are not able to deal with it in time, but we need to start changing our relationship with water. It's very important. And private sector, we need to be harsher on, there's definitely getting away with pollution. And someone said something about the polluter pay. Yes, we have the polluter pay principle. It's about enforcement. It's about making sure that people actually pay. And let's take Sasol, for example, right? Sasol has been in court since 2022, I think, around knowingly releasing high levels of toxic chemicals into the Vaal River system. They're still in court because they have the money to go on and on and on and on. So they are, departments are trying to hold them accountable, but we need civil society voices to say to Sasol, listen, you were wrong, but they will never do that. So people are trying, even with the agricultural sector. We are using chemicals in our agricultural sector that are banned in Europe, but we use it here as happily as we can. So those are the kinds of things that we need to start, pushing back on, because it affects and water, by the way, as you saw in the most recent article by Groundup, is that it's the food systems, it's the health systems, that it affects all of that. The fact that 46% of our clinics don't have running water, how does it even work, or clean water? So I think it's all linked, and I think that there are the policies and regulations, the NEMA is there to allow us to hold those accountable. The challenge is that when you're a small NGO without a balance that can take things to court, it's a challenge. I mean, imagine being in court for 3 years with Sasol.
No,
We'd
no,
be broke
it's
by now.
crazy. Yeah, it's interesting because the private sector argument comes up a lot, not just in the water sector. Obviously, a part-time hobby of South Africans is complaining about the government. And since I've become a journalist, like government incompetencies and corruption is actually like really bad, even worse than I realized. But at the same time, there are so many smart, hardworking people even in local government, like you're saying, we've met them at Joburg Water, really smart people. Plus, private sector, a private company, the incentive is to make a profit. It isn't to provide free basic water to someone who can't afford it. So you do have to be really, really careful. This is so interesting, and there's so many more things I want to discuss, but we have to wrap up and do final thoughts. Mike, what would you like to say?
Okay, I just wanted to remind people, because a lot of you weren't around, that Joburg Water was set up as a really efficient organization by virtue of giving a French company, Suez Lyonnaise des Eaux, a 5-year contract saying, put all of these different municipalities together and make them into an organization that works well. And I did some work at the time, actually going around interviewing people down to foreman, down to general worker level, saying, how do you find this structure with this private company running? They said, it's fantastic. The nice thing about this, it stops the councillors from coming in and asking us to come and fix something in their neighborhood because it's a problem for them, or in fact, come and fix something in their house. Because we have to fill out a job card, and without that job card, we can't even get any material or any kilometers on our trucks. It allows us to do our job properly. And what that taught me, and it was done very well and very successfully, and it's taken about 10 years to break down the structure that was working so well that when you phoned up for a leak, you got it fixed within 4 hours. What made that work was the fact that they were under a very tight municipal contract, which was overseen by very good people at the time when we used to put good people in local government before they got excited about going to national. And it worked. So we must just be careful not to imagine that public is always good and private bad. When public uses the private well, you get the very good results. And I'd like us to think that we can try and do that, because over the next little while, and someone's just asked a question about the World Bank money that's coming into the city water budgets. They will be asking, not necessarily to get private companies to do the work, but saying, if we spend this much money, how are we going to get the results from that? And you can do it through a public or you can do it through a private channel. But if we don't see results, you're not going to get your money. And that's going to be a very, very interesting discipline for our municipalities. And it's not just Gauteng, it's national. National metros. We really do need to start incentivizing, getting people the money so they can do the job properly and show that they're doing the job properly, and then be rewarded, pat them on the head for doing it properly.
No, agreed. We really need to think about incentives, and your knowledge today has been really insightful and helpful. Thank you so much, Mike, for coming on and taking time to speak about it. Ferrial, I am always in awe of your resilience and positivity when you're faced. You have a really tough job. I just wanted to, just as a final thought, like, I don't want to end on a despondent way, because this is a really huge crisis, but why is it important that we keep going and people on this webinar continue to use their voice and don't just sort of feel like, that's that Greek guy rolling the the rock up the mountain,
Yeah, because the one thing I've realized is that, with our water testing, our water quality testing kits, with the advocacy, there's a growing civil society voice across South Africa. And we've gotten to where we are now with the platform, with the presidential working groups. All of these kind of things have happened because we have not remained silent. And when I say we, I'm not just saying, WaterCAN, but a whole group of people, Water Crisis Committee, other kind of water activists, other social justice activists, that it is only through pushing back. It is only through keeping our voices loud that we're going to see some change. Julia, 2 years, maybe 3 years ago when we started, Joburg Water wouldn't even pick up the phone for us. right? We're now on WhatsApp communication, and that is only because we built on the ground from the bottom up. And there are people, there's Beckersdale, there's Be the Future, who've just tested, they shared the results with their municipality, and there are municipalities who are willing to engage. Lesedi has told us they want to meet with us. So through this kind of work that we do as activists and civil society, it's really, there are pockets of hope. And it's the reason we've moved so far, or where we are right now, is because of civil society voices. And I see a lot of activists and people working on in different streams on the chat. They have all also, it's those voices. So don't stop reporting. Don't stop reporting the leaks. Don't stop reporting pollution. Be the whistleblowers.
Yeah.
And it's that has pushed back. And it's why we have a better understanding of what's going on in government, and government is willing to engage. And Mike is right. It's not always about stones. I make jokes, but they do push us sometimes to protest.
And I know that Ferrial, you have a lot of respect for Mike as well. Unfortunately, the webinar has come to a close, but Mike, really quick, do you have any final thoughts? I know you've obviously been in the space for decades, and it can be incredibly frustrating when you kind of see a solution and there's all this misinformation going around or people not understanding. Why is this so important that we keep on going, and why are you even here today, like to help? Why do you think it's important to make it clear to the public what we need to be focused on? Just really quickly. Sorry. It's like the end, but Mike, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was losing a lot of that. Just closing thought.
Yeah,
complicated business, as you know. And I think it's very important that we have sessions like this where we can talk and get the knowledge out and share it. And that, I think, has been very valuable. The trouble is with social media, you have to do it over and over and over again and get it out as far as you possibly can. So thanks very much for setting it up. And it's really nice to be with you guys. But it's going to be a tough couple of years, and we all are going to have to work together to try and make it less bad than it needs to be, you know, and I think we can do that. I think we're on track.
I agree.
And Julia, one more thing, sorry. Thank you so much to the Daily Maverick and to Julia for writing the stories. I think it gets out the stories, and sometimes it really helps our cause. So thank you so much.
Yes. No, it's been really interesting and important to have this conversation with you guys. And I'm glad that we have a governance and civil society perspective. And thanks everyone who tuned in. I'm always really impressed with people who take time out of their workday to have a intelligent conversation. Like, this is my job, so I have to be here, but you guys are choosing to. So that's very impressive. No, I'm joking. I would listen anyway. But thanks so much, guys. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And thank you so much to the speakers. Cheers, everyone.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Yes.